You baby-proof the outlets. You check the car seat twice. You wake up at 3 a.m. because the room got too quiet. Keeping a child alive today can feel like a full-time job, even with hospitals, vaccines, and a phone that can call for help in seconds. Now imagine doing it with none of that. No doctors, no safe formula if milk ran out, no walls thick enough to keep out a hungry animal, and no pharmacy down the street for the fever that would not break. For most of human history, that was simply what raising a child looked like, and the odds were brutal. Anthropologist Hillard Kaplan of the University of New Mexico spent years studying the life history data of the Ache and the Hiwi, two hunter-gatherer groups in South America whose way of life offers a working window into ancestral conditions. Kaplan's research found that in these societies, roughly 40% of children died before reaching adulthood. Not from any single catastrophe, from the ordinary hazards of infancy and childhood, repeated year after year, illness, accidents, and food shortages that a modern child would likely survive without anyone noticing. If that was the baseline, the real question is not why child mortality was so high. It is how any children survived at all, generation after generation, long enough for you to exist. The answer turns out to have very little to do with the parents alone. Anthropologist Kristen Hawkes of the University of Utah spent decades studying the Hadza, a hunter-gatherer community in Tanzania, and noticed something that did not fit the assumption that mothers raise children mostly by themselves. Hawkes tracked how much food older women who were past their own childbearing years contributed to the group, specifically to their grandchildren. She found that Hadza grandmothers spent long hours digging up tubers and gathering food, then handed a significant share of it directly to their daughters' children. Households with an active grandmother saw better weaning outcomes and higher child survival than households without one. This became known as the grandmother hypothesis, and it reframes something that looks, at first glance, like a strange quirk of human biology. Humans are one of the only species where females routinely live for decades after they stop being able to have children of their own. Hawkes argued that this extended post-reproductive life was not incidental. A grandmother who kept working, kept gathering, and kept feeding her daughter's children may have directly increased how many of those grandchildren lived to grow up. Menopause, in this light, is not a design flaw. It may be a feature that evolution kept because it worked. Grandmothers were not the only extra hands. Primatologist and anthropologist Sarah Blaffer Hrdy of the University of California, Davis spent much of her career documenting what she called cooperative breeding in early human groups. In her research, Hrdy compared humans to almost every other great ape, where infants are cared for almost exclusively by their biological mother. Human infants, by contrast, were regularly held, carried, fed, and watched by aunts, older siblings, fathers, and unrelated group members, a pattern Hrdy termed alloparenting. A mother who could hand her child to someone else for even part of the day could keep foraging, resting, or caring for a sick child without her infant going unwatched. Hrdy's argument was direct. Human children survived in large part because they were never anyone's job alone. Picture that scene for a moment. A mother sets her infant down beside an older sibling barely old enough to walk steadily herself, while a grandmother nearby cracks open a tuber to mash into something soft enough for small gums to manage. An aunt passes by and picks the baby up without being asked, because that is simply what everyone in the group did. No single person was solely responsible for keeping that child breathing through the day. The entire camp was. The physical closeness itself turns out to have mattered as much as the extra hands. Anthropologist Melvin Connor of Emory University spent years documenting infant care among the Juhoansi, a hunter-gatherer people of the Kalahari. Connor found that Juhoansi infants were held in near constant physical contact with a caregiver, often carried in a sling against the body throughout the day, and nursed briefly but extremely frequently, sometimes every 13 minutes on average, rather than on any fixed schedule. That pattern kept an infant warm, close, and fed in small, steady amounts rather than large, infrequent ones, and it meant a caregiver could respond to the first sign of distress almost instantly, long before a problem became dangerous. Constant contact was not gentle parenting as a lifestyle choice. In an environment with real predators and no safe place to set a baby down alone, it was closer to a survival requirement. Even with a full support network, some children needed far more than food and extra hands. In the 1980s, archaeologist Glenn Doran of Florida State University led excavations at Windover Pond in Florida, an 8,000-year-old burial site remarkably well preserved in the acidic, oxygen-poor peat. Among the burials, Doran's team identified the remains of a child with a severe congenital condition, a form of spina bifida that would have left the child unable to walk without significant assistance. The skeletal evidence showed this child had lived to roughly 15 years old, far longer than the condition alone would predict without sustained, deliberate care. That single skeleton tells a quiet story. Someone carried this child for years. Someone made sure they were fed, kept warm, and protected in a mobile hunter-gatherer group where the ability to walk usually determined whether you could keep up. Windover was not an isolated case in the archaeological record either. Similar patterns, individuals who survived for years despite disabilities that should have been fatal early on, have turned up at other ancient sites, suggesting this kind of sustained care was not a rare exception, but a real, if demanding, part of how these groups operated. Here is the twist worth sitting with. It would be easy to assume that in a world with 40% child mortality, communities became hardened to loss, investing less in any individual child because so many would not make it anyway. The archaeological and anthropological record says close to the opposite. Groups appear to have pooled resources specifically to protect their most vulnerable members, the very young and the visibly disabled, even when that care came at a real cost to the adults doing it. High mortality did not make ancient communities careless. It may have made the case for cooperative care more urgent, not less. There is a practical logic hiding inside that pattern. A single mother trying to raise a child completely alone, with no grandmother, no aunt, no one to hold the baby while she gathered food or slept, was almost certainly at a disadvantage compared to a mother embedded in a group that shared the load. Over enough generations, the groups that cooperated most effectively around child survival would simply have more surviving children than the groups that did not. Cooperative care was not just kindness. It was a strategy that outcompeted the alternative, quietly one surviving child at a time, across thousands of years. You baby-proof the outlets. You check the car seat twice. You may do most of it alone, or with a partner, in a house designed for exactly 2 adults and their children, with no grandmother down the hall and no group of aunts taking turns. That arrangement is, by the standard of almost all of human history, unusual. Somewhere underneath the modern instinct to worry alone at 3 a.m. sits a much older system, one built not around a single set of parents doing everything alone, but around grandmothers who kept working long after they needed to, aunts and older siblings who simply picked up a crying baby without being asked, and a community willing to carry a child for 15 years because that was what keeping a child alive actually required. The next time someone offers to hold your baby for 10 minutes so you can shower, or a grandparent shows up with dinner during a hard week, that is not a modern courtesy. It is one of the oldest survival systems your species ever built, still quietly running. If stories like this one make you see your own everyday life differently, hit subscribe. A new story from the deep past goes up every week.